We have been studying Sri Aurobindo's description in the Life Divine of the transition in rebirth and the content that is actually carried into the new birth and the whole logic of rebirth itself. Some important ideas to recapitulate. First, that we have to make a distinction between the soul itself and the personality which it puts forward. The soul is immortal. The personality that it forms, consisting of mind, life energy, and a physical body, is temporary, with a very narrow focus for a particular line of experience which the soul wants to have for its development. It is not the soul itself which is the personality, but the personality is what it takes on almost like a mask, which it has to shed when it withdraws from the life, as we discussed earlier, through three stages: shedding the physical body, the vital body, and the mental body, which are all three dissolved, but retaining the essential elements of the growth and the experience of learning. And the personality, Sri Aurobindo points out, is formed again anew depending on the line of experience that it chooses, drawing from all past personalities to the extent that it finds necessary and helpful for the purpose that it wants in this life. Over a series of lives, over a long period of time, there is a gathering of a variety of formations which have been used in the past, developed to whatever degree, and which represent a kind of a storehouse of capacities and past development, which make for the rich play in the present and possibility for the future. And the more numerous these veiled personalities are, the more rich the new personality, the more complexity in the development. There is a clear sense that this person who is growing through these personalities is ready for a leap in evolution to the next stage beyond the mental evolution. And the more these personalities are harmonized, the more we recognize an advanced stage of the individual's evolution. In this scheme, the false importance which our mind attaches to memory of past lives goes away. We realize even that memory of past life, that is of past personality, would hinder the possibility of the new experience in the new personality. And so it is even necessary for those memories to be set aside, to be erased. Because this text of the Life Divine is intended to present every viewpoint and even contradictions of different approaches. Sri Aurobindo takes great pains, as we saw last time, to present different religious or philosophical viewpoints, some of which even declare that the surface personality may not remember, but the soul looks back and has this experience of learning from the good and the bad of the personality, and so on. But Sri Aurobindo points out that the whole idea of rebirth being for the sake of virtue and overcoming of vice, of reward and punishment, becomes not only foolish, but also illogical once we look at things in depth in this manner. So the whole purpose is growth, not reward or punishment. In the last paragraph that we read, Sri Aurobindo highlighted the serious obstacle that the prolongation of the old temperament of character can bring in the free development of the soul, and which would bind you into a useless repetition of past experiences or limitations. And the focus he brings is on the soul personality growing. So we have to now add to our perspective this new term of vocabulary. There is the surface personality which is put on as a mask, and then there is a soul personality which is evolving, which is an aspect of the soul's maturity and the soul's growth. And this soul personality is gathering in sum the experiences of the past for a growth which makes it rich and complex. This soul personality will infuse itself into the material of the surface personality, as if informing it with certain tendencies or values which it has brought from past development, from which it can draw out facets of achievement, of experience as necessary for a situation that appears before you, a challenge that appears before you. And all of these are being gathered on the inner level of which we are not conscious on the surface. Sri Aurobindo gives in passing an example, which we saw last time, as a tree grows by subconscient or inconscient assimilation of action of sun and rain and wind and absorption of earth elements, so the being grows by subliminal or intraconscient assimilation and absorption of its results of past becoming and an output of potentialities of future becoming. Now this we have seen last time already, but I want to draw attention to this, to view it now from a deeper insight. You have to keep in mind that Sri Aurobindo never wastes a single word, and every word is very carefully selected for all the nuances which it carries. And he does not especially waste an analogy of this kind. He has used tree earlier in a different context when he discusses the development of the tree from a seed as an example for how forms emerge from a seed idea. And this was in context of what he has described as a supramental real idea, which is like a seed containing itself the full potential of the development. And there he gave this example that the entire tree as if lives inside the seed. In the seed you do not see any sign of the tree, neither its size, nor its material, nor its capacities. None of these exist inside the seed. And yet, all these potentially are held in the seed and drawn out by some seemingly miraculous process. Now again he gives the example of a tree growing by subconscient or inconscient assimilation. And he links it or makes a similarity to the being growing by subliminal or intraconscient assimilation and absorption. And this past example and the present example join when we look deeply. Remember, the seed is carrying a potentiality. And like the real idea in the supermind, it knows as if everything of what it should do, when it should do, according to a situation. And depending on the kind of soil it has, depending on the opportunity it receives with the water, with the air, with the sun, it takes all that material that comes, none of which can be pre-planned. The seed may grow in semi-arid conditions, it may grow in extremes of water, and yet it adapts. And as it grows, it may be stamped upon by somebody, the stalk that is growing may be crushed, and yet it knows how to rebuild itself. A gardener may come and cut the plant in many different ways, and yet it knows how to heal and grow. And if somehow the seasonal variations of temperature are not quite what they should be, it still knows how to retain how to hold back its energy and then flower once again when the correct season comes. Extraordinarily complex knowledge and power to actualize that knowledge is held in the seed, but the seed itself has nothing of the material of the tree. It gathers the material from outside. It forms that material with the knowledge and the will, so to say, that it carries and shapes the form of the tree. And as the plant grows, the seed itself seems to vanish. We do not see anymore the seed. This pure knowledge will now lives inside the new body form that is created out of new gathered material upon which it continues to build, and from which then it throws out new seeds. And each of those seeds carries in it as if this knowledge will material with all the knowledge and power required to form an entire new tree in a completely different environment and circumstance. And so this relationship is interesting to see, and you relate it to the soul and the personality on the surface. Here Sri Aurobindo has taken the example of how the seed grows by a subconscious or inconscient assimilation of action. And then he lists sun, rain, wind, and absorption of earth elements. Now it's very significant. It's almost like an example you could give to a little child, but Sri Aurobindo is not handling it on that level alone. If you look deeply, he is speaking of the four elements: the air, fire, water, and earth. The four elements from which the seed is drawing material to form the body, and at the same time from the experience of the body formed of these four elements and their impact on the body, it gathers experience to grow. So a tree grows by subconscious or inconscient assimilation of action of sun and rain and wind and absorption of earth elements. Who is growing and who is the tree? Not the body of the material it has gathered, but this consciousness that lives inside it, which is built of this knowledge and will, which manages this body. And so, in the same way, the being grows by a subliminal or intraconscient assimilation and absorption of its results of past becoming. Now here the analogy first on the deeper side, we too in our surface personality are formed of these materials, the four elements which are gathered. And it's as if the fifth element, which you do not see, you never feel, is the power and the knowledge within of the soul, which gathers the material, forms it, lives in it, and then gathers experiences from it. And in this case, the analogy goes much further than the seed and the tree. All the past lives and all their experiences are absorbed through those formations created with the four elements each time. And the result of all this is held and preparing for an output of potentialities of future becoming. So this I wanted to dwell upon before we move forward. Now the next paragraph which we will begin considers the example of an existing life and how we lose memory and yet retain personality as we go along. And with this example, he builds a whole perspective on what is the nature of the content that is carried, and how, in spite of forgetting specifics, the growth of the personality still continues. And at a certain stage of the development, the retention of past memories on some deeper level can actually be made available to the surface personality. What is the relationship of those memories with the surface personality? And this will prepare us for a much richer and more important discussion, which will be how then can the growing personality actually participate in the soul's growth and not be merely a mask, but an actual expression of the soul consciously. So we take this up now. The absence of any memory of past existences is wrongly and very ignorantly taken as a disproof of the actuality of rebirth. For if even in this life it is difficult to keep all the memories of our past, if they often fade into the background or fade out altogether, if no recollection remains of our infancy, and yet with all this hiatus of memory, we can grow and be. If the mind is even capable of total loss of memory of past events and its own identity, and yet it is the same being who is there, and the lost memory can one day be recovered, it is evident that so radical a change as a transition to other worlds, followed by new birth in a new body, ought normally to obliterate altogether the surface or mental memory, and yet would not annul the identity of the soul or the growth of the nature. It's a long sentence where he's given a series of examples which justify and make you recognize why you would normally forget everything in the new birth, by taking example of our own limited experience in this lifetime. So, and he says, as a result, to think of absence of memory as proof of or disproof of rebirth would be not only wrong but very ignorant. And the logic is compelling. In this life, it is difficult to keep all the memories of our past. How much do we actually remember? If we look back at the last few decades, the last one decade perhaps is more vivid. Go back further, less vivid and less vivid. And then suddenly there are patches of life where suddenly there is a vivid memory, somehow they seem more important to us. And this is obvious as we grow older. We seem to forget more and more. And yet the personality stays the same. That's his point. If you consider your earliest childhood, of which you have practically zero memory, still the personality seen in that early childhood and the personality that grows later is the same, and there's a continuum. They often fade into the background or fade out altogether. And if they often fade into the background or fade out altogether, if no recollection remains of our infancy, and yet with all this hiatus of memory, we can grow and be. So you can practically erase everything and still continue to be and grow, and you have as if lost nothing of what you were as you continue to grow. You are building on the past without retaining memory. He uses this word, all this hiatus of memory, and we have to look at the deeper sense of the word hiatus. It has in its origin, the sense of a gap, the sense of an opening physically. And only later it is seen as a gap in memory, in time, or in continuity of time. And the suggestion here is that each time there is this transition of body form, there is a hiatus, a big gap physically, which of course also becomes a gap in time. And so in the present lifetime also, the same kind of hiatus of time effectively represents some kind of transitions that we have been through. Before teenage, we were a different personality. During teenage, we grow to be something quite different. Post-teenage, when we become more mature, we grow into something quite different. And there are distinct stages in development where the personality undergoes changes in its sense of self. And often with that comes some kind of a shift in the memory and recollections. But we can grow and be, the two things required. You still remain you, and you still continue to grow. And now comes the extreme of the example. If the mind is even capable of total loss of memory of past events and its own identity, and yet it is the same being who is there. And we have examples of people who get a knock, injury to the head or accident, and they wake up without recognizing anybody, not knowing who they were in terms of name and memories, And yet they are able to speak coherently, the language is still intact. They're able to ask, who are you, what are you doing here, what am I, who am I, what am I doing here? I have no memory of who I was, and yet the personality which is acting is exactly the same, except that the memory is not there. And this example is so telling. One can introspect on this kind of experience. What would it be like if today, at this moment, you forgot completely all your past memories? How would it change you? Would you still be the same person? In your responses to circumstances, nothing has changed. Only you do not know whether such and such a person is actually your relative or a stranger, but the way you meet a stranger is how you meet your relative now, and it's the same way. And once accepting that this stranger is a relative, you will still behave the same way as you did before. The loss of specifics of memory changes nothing of who you are, and more importantly, the sense of continuity in your growth. There is even a particular kind of illness where a person loses complete memory every day. So they wake up in the morning, no memory of what was done yesterday or what happened yesterday. There are interesting movies which explore this kind of a life, and one of the things the person does in order to remember and extend his continuity is to write on his arm a message of what he did and what he needs to do. Otherwise, as a person, he is exactly the same. He is continuing to grow every day, but the memory is not there. And then one more point that he brings. If the mind is capable of total loss of memory of past events and its own identity, and yet it is the same being who is there. And then one more point, and the lost memory can one day be recovered. And this also happens in spite of having lived now for a few years post-accident, where no memory exists of that earlier life. One day suddenly the memory comes back and integrates seamlessly with your existing memory, and the continuity is all there. Or it tends to come back in fragments. Oh yes, now I have a vague sense of having been here with you, although I don't remember who you were and I don't remember having come here, but there's a familiarity, and somehow the fact that I'm with you in this place feels like it might have happened before. No clear memory. Or from that feeling of familiarity, a memory comes. I remember you said this and I said that, but I don't remember having come the 10 times that we did, just this one incident. And this example Sri Aurobindo is bringing forward is so similar to the past life recollections, and we will see the similarity further as we go along. The sense of what was done emerges, the details may or may not follow. But even if this did not come, you are still the same and you can continue to grow. When it does come back, you have a seamless sense of continuity in the memory, or fragments which still add to the same direction of growth. And the same happens when a past life memory is recovered. First, as a general sense of familiarity, it feels like I might have been in this place. And then a vivid flash of a single incident. And the mother recalls when she visited Venice, and she had a distinct sense of having been there in one of the past incarnations. She entered a room and the full memory came flooding back of being strangled and thrown out from that window of the room into the water outside. A painful memory. But that's all, not the details of the rest. Is it possible to access those details? We will see it is, and he will explain how. But the point is, none of that matters. And if it does not matter, the soul would prefer not to bring it forward because it will interfere if it does come forward. And it changes nothing of your growth. In fact, you're better off without it. But if this is the nature of the change in a normal life, that you lose memories and at best recall certain elements, then it is evident that so radical a change as a transition to other worlds followed by new birth in a new body ought normally to obliterate altogether the surface or mental memory. What happens when you leave the body? You've shed the physical body, you've shed the vital body, the mental body. What remains then? None of the material remaining. You have only, at best, some sense of the memories or the imprints. And then you have made a transition into a completely different world in an altogether different state of consciousness. So radically different that at the moment of entry into those worlds, the whole earth memory and the earth zone fades out as a distant, far away impression. If you read some of the near-death experiences, you get a hint of how radically different these spaces are. When you enter the new world, the higher worlds into which you go to rest, it's such a relief. You're back home, it is familiar, and you've come back from a long journey, and all the memories of that old journey rapidly fade away. All those personal attachments you had with people, your children, your siblings, your parents, all fade out and somehow seem to have such a limited or no value at all into this which you come back to, which is your home. And so having made that radical change of transition to a new world, and then another radical change of taking on a new body with all the new material, a new mental substance to form your mental body, new vital substance to form your vital body, and then entering the physical body. Unfortunately, in the current state of evolution, we are not able to gather material of the physical substance to form a physical body directly. We need to depend on nature's biological birth process. But if you see what's being done in the mental world and the vital world, where the material is so much more plastic, you can simply will together and gather material to form your body and then infuse it with your personality and grow from there. Potentially in future, the suggestion is that you should be able to gather similarly the physical substance. The thing which prevents you from doing it is the physical substance is rigid, hard, form-bound. And so you have to have a form ready into which you infuse your consciousness rather than being able to gather it. But if your own power of consciousness is sufficiently evolved, you should be able to even gather physical matter. And this is the direction that Sri Aurobindo has elsewhere suggested. The supramental being would be able to gather material for its physical body, and it will be not born in the normal way. The problem with the normal way of birth, again, is that at the point where your consciousness enters the physical body, the brain is not developed. Its formation is still so crude that you may come with a formed mind, and infusing it into physical material that is unformed, you lose so much of what you have. Or, as the mother describes it, the entry into the physical body is stunning. It's like a stunning blow which hits you, in which you forget everything. Forget even who you are, forget your sense of purpose, forget the specific knowledge and intentions that you may have deliberately attempted to bring into this body. And the coarse or crude development of the brain itself at that point dulls everything or is incapable of holding the nuances of what is brought. As the brain gradually grows, it comes into some capacity of reception around the age of 5, which is the time when most people have some sense of partial awakening to a sense of purpose. Almost every case of a person who is spiritually mature, around the age of 5, there is a distinct experience where the direction of life is set or given, but again in a very general way. As you grow older, there are further transition points where elements may suddenly come forward. There are cases where, having passed through a completely normal life with no sense of the spiritual, around the age of 18, when the individuality has been sufficiently formed, suddenly the memory comes flooding back. Oh, this is what it is. This is who I am. This is the purpose for which I have come. And we know of cases like this, where suddenly the spiritual side came forward and the life took a different turn. Now you notice in each of these cases where something comes, however partial, It has to struggle against the body's incapacity to retain and hold what the personality is already ready for. And so the soul has as if to hold back these elements and infuse them progressively into the personality as the body particularly grows in maturity. So again, you have gone through a massively disorienting experience in the rebirths in a new body. And obviously through all this, he says, ought normally to obliterate altogether the surface or mental memory. It will not obliterate the deeper inner memory of the soul, obviously, because that is the same. But the surface mental memory, even if the soul had retained something of it, would be lost in this much. Consider also in certain cases where the rebirth may take place after a long period of time, which you may have spent wandering or exploring other subtle worlds. Maybe 100 years. And if for 100 years in your physical life you cannot recall things of your younger age, what if you have gone through much more radically different and rich experiences of the subtle worlds, and then you come back for a rebirth? How much would you retain of the mental memory of the previous life? Practically nothing. And it wouldn't matter anyway. And yet, that would not annul the identity of the soul or the growth of the nature. And this is what we are concerned with. You are still the same being, and the same sense of your nature and your direction of growth. This obliteration of the surface mental memory is all the more certain and quite inevitable if there is a new personality of the same being and a new instrumentation which takes the place of the old. A new mind, a new life, a new body. So this obliteration, ob is against litere, is the letters. Literally the sense of the word, the root comes from erasing letters or striking a line across letters, to obliterate. And he's using this word now in a very interesting way. Past personalities you may almost see as letters or words or sentences of a novel. The novel of the soul's journey, in which things have been written out and are now as if obliterated, erasing the letters as it moves forward. So what is obliterated surface mental memory? All the more if there is a new personality. Now let us say a person had an accidental death. The growth of the personality is incomplete. It must now take a body continuing broadly the same personality that was, because that work is unfinished. There perhaps some element of the surface memory might still remain. But if now the soul decides, this kind of exploration is over, now I want to take a radically different personality. And at that point, the obliteration would be even greater. And if there is new instrumentation in place of the old, completely new mind, a new life, new body, all the more complete will be the obliteration. The new brain cannot be expected to carry in itself the images held by the old brain. The new life or mind cannot be summoned to keep the deleted impressions of the old mind and life that have been dissolved and exist no more. There are many who have this wrong idea that when you shed the physical body, the vital or mental bodies are kept, and you take back those things and then take back even a physical body with similar material. It's not the case, and as we have seen already before, it would not serve the object of the soul. When it wants a completely different experience, it must gather fresh material, new material. And in that material, you cannot ask for the old memory to somehow come back. There is no doubt the subliminal being which may remember. So there is no doubt the subliminal being which may remember, since it does not suffer from the disabilities of the surface. So where is the memory held? Not in these parts which are being rebuilt each time, but in the subliminal, behind the liminal, behind the lit up conscious part of your personality. So what is this behind? I'm conscious of my thoughts, I'm conscious of my emotions, I'm conscious of my body, but I'm not conscious of all the deeper things which happen in my mind, where actually the larger repository of my capacities are held. So for example, if you are asked, do you remember the last time that you went on top of a mountain? Immediately your surface mind, which you are conscious of, turns as if to remember, and the memory comes forward. But you never consciously went into all your past memory to sift out that one memory. The memory just came forward. In response to what? Your intention to know. Who or what in that inner huge storehouse of memories recognized what you wanted and put forward what you needed at that moment? It's an interesting question. And when you start introspecting subjectively, you realize it's an automatic process. And you can ask yourself any complex question of however degree of difficulty. Do you remember the last time that you were on a holiday and you got upset? Now, this is a more complex memory. You have to reach out. And again, you go back and are waiting now. It does not come immediately. And then something comes, or maybe one or two things, 3 or 4 things, and something emerges suddenly as a distinct memory. Ah, yes, this is it. But you never actively reached into all the complexity of past memory to draw this out. What you realize is there is a whole machinery behind which is far more capable, far more rich, far wider, of which we are a narrow frontal mental personality. And the same exists for the vital and even the physical layers. And all of this is what Sri Aurobindo calls the subliminal, as distinct from the subconscious. The subconscious is that part where the consciousness itself is as if lost. And if you were to enter into the subconscious, you too would become unconscious, semi-conscious or unconscious. But when you enter the subliminal, you are differently conscious in a part of yourself which you are not normally aware of. It is into these subliminal regions that one enters, either under deep meditation, or even under partial hypnosis, or sometimes in deep sleep. Not always the sleep is deep, but when it is deep, we do enter into these spaces. And the experiences we have there are what we recall as dreams, or in state of deep meditation, certain distinct experiences, or under hypnosis, we are able to recall or draw out memories of things which would otherwise be impossible for us to access, even with a conscious intention. With a conscious intention, if you're asked, how many steps did you take since you got out of bed this morning? Even if you try to recall, you cannot. All the details are as if blurred. You never registered them, and the surface memory is unable to hold that kind of information. But under hypnosis, when you are pushed into or have access to this subliminal domain, you will come up with a precise number, 823. Where did that come from? And it's part of the subliminal capacity of the mind. Sri Aurobindo, in a different discussion in the Life Divine, points out that within the subliminal are held all of our greater potentialities. Their emergence from the subliminal into the formed surface conscious layers is the sense of evolution that we have. In other words, all that exists as a possibility there or as a capacity there is meant eventually to come out on the surface, representing your real growth. Again, we come back to the analogy of the seed, which contains within it the full potentiality of the tree and has to draw it out, so to say, using the materials on the surface. So this subliminal keeps the memory, since it does not suffer from the disabilities of the surface. It may remember. But the surface mind is cut off from the subliminal memory, which alone might retain some clear recollection or distinct impression of past lives. Might remain. Doesn't matter. It may not keep everything, but it may have something. Clear recollection or distinct impression would be felt only there. This is the reason why under hypnosis, sometimes people are able to recall things from past life if the hypnosis is deep enough and if the hypnotist is not bringing in his own projections. This is a problem of any hypnosis, that if the hypnotist comes with a very strong fixed idea, it reflects in the person who is undergoing the hypnosis. And so, unfortunately, we find when the hypnotist has a strong bias, it can cloud and even lead to fake memories under hypnosis. So these are not reliable methods. But if the hypnotist comes without a bias, and if the person is led into a sufficiently deep state, then the access can be to certain recollections or distinct impressions. But why is there this gap? Why can't we access these deeper layers? He explains, this separation is necessary because the new personality has to be built up on the surface without conscious reference to what is within. As with all the rest of the superficial being, so our surface personality too is indeed formed by an action from within. But of that action, it is not conscious. It seems to itself to be self-formed or ready-made or formed by some ill-understood action of universal nature. How do you think you came to be this person? Well, I can go back in memory, I was a child, but how did I form? Or even today, what keeps me what I am, I'm not conscious of. Somehow it happened. I just happened to be, and that's all you can say. But the process of building the surface personality was led by this inner layer. It built up everything by an action from within. Now he says, as everything else, all the rest of the superficial being, so our surface personality too is formed by an action from within. What does he mean by this everything else? And again, we have to go back to other passages in the Life Divine where he has elaborated on this idea. One of the examples he has given is what happens, let's say, in an animal, largely formed and driven by instinctive behavior. What happens when the instinct is challenged? Let's say this animal is used to a particular kind of response. It knows to eat this particular seed only. It knows to build a nest with twigs as it is used to. And suddenly a situation arises which it has never faced before, for which the instinct has no pre-programmed response. What happens then? Especially when the animal is brought in relation to a human being. Suddenly he does not have the nest of the kind he wanted, doesn't have access to the twigs or the seeds that he is used to eating. What do you do? And at that point there's this confusion. If instinct was all, then very likely the animal would not know to respond appropriately and there would be failure of evolution. Every time there is a radical change, a volcano explodes or there's a major earthquake or a tsunami, and suddenly the environment is radically upset, the routine of the animal is broken and the instincts do not know how to handle this. You would end up with life collapsing. If not for the fact that within the animal, in that seed consciousness, is the precise knowledge and the power to act upon the surface personality to guide it. And Sri Aurobindo explains it is at that point that the soul within pushes forward an impulse to nudge the personality in a particular direction of behavior or response. And repeated such nudges then create the habit in the surface personality, which then becomes the new instinct in the face of this response. I've given a very strange example earlier also on several occasions of a study that observed sheep crossing a human-made highway. I remember sheep in their instinct of species have never faced highways except in the last few decades. They've never seen cars except in the last few decades. They've never been hit by a car from neglect or negligence. Seeing a car move, the sheep would not normally know there is danger. Walking on a highway where there are no cars, there would be no instinct to tell you that there is a danger. Until it's too late, the car suddenly comes and hits. And what is interesting is this study observed every time the sheep approached the highway, their pulse rate began to increase. They had experiences or sensations of fear, panic, until they crossed the highway quickly, and then again there was a relief and the pulse rate dropped. Now this can be a newborn sheep which has never seen a car, never been knocked on the highway. And yet this instinct has formed sufficiently over the last few, let's say, decades of enough sheep being hit that somehow the species consciousness has developed this instinct. But still that does not explain how did it develop it in the first place. And the explanation comes because somewhere inside there is this thing which knows danger zone, be careful, and it amplifies the state of alertness, puts an impulse to quickly run over this patch which looks strange, to which you have no other reference, and inculcates in the species consciousness this new instinct, until it has now formed and adapted to the changed environment. Now imagine how slow this process would be. Take a complex operation in the human body such as swallowing food. When you swallow food, a newborn baby has never done that, does not know what is to swallow. It gets food in its mouth and instinctively it starts a movement which then ripples through the esophagus, gets into the stomach and triggers a chain of digestion. None of which has ever been taught to it. It has never experienced. And this instinct is programmed how? If you go back through the stages of evolution, you will come to something which is almost at the level of the bacteria. When it absorbs material through its surface skin to eat, there is a trigger to take it in and then close the barrier through which it has taken the food. This first instinct would be formed by the impulse from within, nudging the bacteria to form the instinct. Then as it grows into more complex structures, at each step of complexity, the instinct would be shaping new behavior patterns. Until it, through a series of stages, develops the esophagus structure and teaches the instinct now to ripple through. When the first muscle compresses, the second follows, the third follows, and the first releases by the time the third compresses to create this ripple that pushes the food in. And with each development of a new layer, there would be the instinct which would be adding a new training layer. If you look at all the effort going back millions or billions of years to form this simple instinct of the swallowing movement, and now consider all the complexity of the behavior that takes place in the biology simply to keep our body alive, in the emotional nature to build healthy relations and survival instincts, and then in our mind to even start thinking of and give to the mind a higher turn of overcoming challenges and organizing your life to become more comfortable. All of these instincts have taken such a long time and have been formed by the inner push at each step, programming the surface personality. So when he says this here, that as with the rest of the superficial being, so our surface personality too is indeed formed by an action from within. But of that action, it is not conscious. So if all the physical construction of the biology and all the rest has taken place through an inner action, the personality forming within you is also taking place by an inner action. And let's look at what that means. You face a situation in childhood, somebody insults you, and there is the normal old reaction of anger, upset, sadness. And then from within there is a nudge that feels uncomfortable with this response. And there is another nudge which provokes an introspection of what would I want to feel? How would I want to relate? and then a nudge which gives you the impulse to actually go out and make that effort to correct. There's an interesting incident which I have always retained as a beautiful example of teaching, which is an actual story of a teacher watching two children fight. And after a while, one of the children comes and sits next to her. He's upset, unhappy. And the teacher was trained not to interfere but to assist in the child becoming conscious. So she stays quiet for a while, and then from a very quiet, inwardly centered place, she asks the child, what happened? No reaction, no criticism, no judgment, just what happened? And because she is quiet, the child is also drawn into an inner poise of quietness. And he says, I fought with my best friend. And he's upset. And then she asks, what do you feel? And he looks within and says, it's hurting here in my chest. And then she asks, she allows this movement to settle. He is now surprised that he is feeling this pain. She asks, what do you want to do? And again, a brief introspection. I want to be friends with him. And after a pause, she asks, what's preventing you? And he looks inside and realizes, gets up, goes, makes friends, they start playing, and they start fighting again. But this process of steps of introspection that she led him to, it exposes first that there is already inside a precise knowledge. If only he had begun that introspection on his own, he would have been led by it. But he doesn't normally. And that inner knowledge has to work through this confused surface personality through a series of nudges to somehow get it to get there. But in this case, the assistance from outside to introspect and make reference to the inner nudge, which already knows and has the capacity to do, speeded up the process. In the formation of the personality, that one event would be the most significant. After this, for the rest of his life, the child, every time facing a challenge, every time feeling this pain in his chest, would turn in, recognize what he truly wants, what is preventing it, and begin to make small steps to overcome. And this was a formation which, like a seed, continues to grow, forming and shaping the personality as it develops. Always from within, the nudge comes. If within there was nothing which gave you that knowledge, when being asked, what do you want? The child would say, I don't know, I'm just dull, I don't feel anything. But I do feel, and in that feeling I do know, and in that knowing I have the power to fulfill what I know. And that's always pushing from inside. But of that action, it, on the surface, is not conscious. It seems to itself to be self-formed or ready-made, or formed by some ill-understood action of universal nature. Oh, that's how it is. Everybody is like that. Everybody feels that. Everybody acts like that. So I too must be somehow, by the same unknown process, be formed. So it appears. And yet, fragmentary recollections of past births do sometimes remain, in spite of these almost insuperable obstacles. It looks as if all these things of complete changing, going through another world, shedding all the past material of personality, gathering new material, and should have completely obliterated, and yet something does come. There are even very few cases of astonishingly exact and full memory in the child mind. Now you don't get that normally in the adult mind. The few cases where you get it in the child mind are generally at the age of 2 to 3. This is important because that's around the time when the brain is sufficiently formed that the child is able to articulate words and put forward certain basic ideas. Before that, the memory might be there and the child may demonstrate discomfort but has no way of articulating. And generally, after that age of 3, the memory also fades out. Because nature or the soul within chooses, now we have done the part which was needed and it's interfering with the surface growth, it goes away. We took an example last time of how children have suddenly spoken of actually belonging to another village, another city, having a different name, remembering all the relatives of that place, remembering being shot. And there's one example which I came across recently, where the person said, I was shot by so-and-so, and he points to a mark, to a place on his chin, and the bullet had gone through and come out on the top of the head. And in this child, physically there was a mark there at both entry and exit points. And so they actually went to the village. He recognized all the relatives, scolded them for not having kept things the way they should have been, and recognized the person who had shot him, and the whole story was verified. In time, the memory does fade, thankfully. So in the child mind, the full memory returns, and that age group is interesting. You will see that in certain occult traditions, this knowledge is used for a purpose. In the Tibetan tradition, there is a great importance given to recognizing an old spiritually developed teacher in his new births and then putting him back on the pedestal on which he was, which you can see now in the existing logic we've been through, will be very harmful for the child's growth, because suddenly you're thrusting them back into the old groove. But the idea or the tradition itself emerges from the Dalai Lama, who is meant to be reincarnated each time to assist in the development of the people. And he is an exceptional being who is already of an exalted state of consciousness, who takes birth for that purpose alone. And so for him it may be useful. And when you look for the newborn child, you look for him when he is about 2 years, between the age of 2 and 3, when exactly this capacity to articulate and for the memory to come forward is there. And he's made to go through a test where this child is placed in a room which has many objects, some used by that previous incarnation and some which are otherwise more attractive, shiny, or used by others. And if the child goes straight to his known object, this is my bowl, this is my stick, or this is the book that I was using, well, you know you are verified, and then a few other signs are sought for to finally validate. But if you miss that age, then the erasing of the memory also begins as the new personality begins to form. In fact, something very important happens typically at the age of 3. And this is confirmed by many who have the knowledge of these things. Around the age of 3, it's the time when the vital personality first enters or comes forward. The physical personality's development has sufficiently happened where the vital personality can come forward, and years down is the mental personality that kicks in and begins to take over. In psychiatry, it is a recognized fact that you cannot consider the personality of the child until after the age of 3. But that's when the vital personality has come and the tendencies of the vital desire nature plug in, so to say. And that coming often triggers the pushing back, the memories which might have been emerging from the subliminal or the soul in that period between 2 and 3. So he gives this example. This happens in spite of the obstacles. Finally, at a certain stage of development of the being, when the inner begins to predominate over the outer and come to the front, past life memory does sometimes begin to emerge, as if from some submerged layer, but more readily in the shape of a perception of the stuff and power of past personalities that are effective in the composition of the being in the present life, than in any precise and accurate detail of event and circumstances, although this too can recur in parts, or be recovered by concentration from the subliminal vision, from some secret memory, or from our inner conscious substance. Again, a complex series of possibilities that he offers, and there's a sequence to these possibilities. And why is this discussion taking place? To prove to you that just because you have forgotten memory does not disprove the actuality of rebirths. So having explained why it would be necessary to forget, having explained the gap between the inner layers which form the outer and lead from within the outer, he says, in spite of all this, the memories do come. And now we see the series of forms in which they come. But all these are aberrations. They do naturally emerge at a certain stage of development, and then it is no more an aberration and can even serve a purpose. So at a certain stage of development of the being, and it is characterized by what? When the inner begins to predominate over the outer and come to the front. This is very important to recognize, to understand what this means and how it happens, and what we can do to assist this to happen for us in our own lives. As things are, look at a child, the outer predominates the inner in most cases. And especially with the system of education that we have, we encourage the predominance of the outer. So if a child is sitting and daydreaming, or sitting in the garden and feeling the space, the parents come, why are you wasting your time? Go out and do something. Read your book, do your homework, talk to someone. The sense of being quiet is seen, or to be introspective, is seen to be somehow a waste of time. And you drive them to push forward more and more. In the school system, you reward the more extrovert child. The introvert is often seen as not interesting, or daydreaming, or lazy, or some criticism. Whereas the child who's pushing forward and doing things is praised. Oh, this guy is so creative and so. Whereas the one introspecting may be creating in his mind, but we don't recognize that. So the values have all been externalized to such a degree that there's a pressure for the child to conform, and even a push to ignore the inner and exaggerate the outer turn. The result is, as the growth proceeds, the outer personality forms with false values, false perverse habits or ideas, which cover the inner. And remember, the whole journey of life is led by the inner nudging the outer. And the more the surface becomes hard, the inner struggles to nudge the outer. It nudges with very little result. And at some point, the outer may be so perverse, so blocked up and dark, that the inner feels suffocated. Which is often the case when the personality becomes extremely crude or perverse from bad habits, and the personality is even got into habits which harm evolution of itself and others. And the inner personality is blocked, unable to push forward, and it suffers. If the inner being is sufficiently developed, it may even consciously call for help from above, from the divine. And the divine response would then come to assist in correcting this perversion. And if it cannot do it by a series of external nudges, it may do it by a shock or a blow that shatters the surface personality and gives the chance for the inner to come forward. And we have many examples, perhaps in our own lives. We've seen people who had a powerful shock, sometimes even a physical accident, and their personality underwent a change. Most often this happens when someone has had a near-death experience. The physical accident led to being exposed briefly to that state outside the surface personality which was knocked out. Being in the subtle body, becoming conscious of something of the inner being and the inner personality while in the subtle, and then you come back and suddenly you're no more the same. Because momentarily this inner part could come forward and imprint itself on the surface memory, and now you're able to continue in the new personality entirely. So you'll say, so-and-so had this great accident, he was unconscious for 3 days, and then after that the whole personality has changed, always for the better. more kind, more loving, more caring, more truly himself or herself. Or a shock causes a deep introspection. What happened? How did this happen? What will happen to me? Someone close to you dies who's younger than you, and what happens to my life? What if I die? And you start looking for your sense of purpose, and you plunge deep, deep, deep. I'll ask this question: what made you turn in when you had the shock? Why didn't you run to a psychiatrist? Why didn't you run to exteriorize further to fill your hole? You turned in. It's almost as if something inside you reached out and pulled you in. You went to such a depth of introspection that you have never experienced before, and you had no way of knowing it was even possible to go so deep, because the inner being pulled you inward. So it pulled you in by exerting its influence on you as strongly as it could. Occasionally, if the inner being is strong enough, it can push from inside and shatter the outer personality. It doesn't need necessarily the outer help. Or generally there's a double action of it pushing intensely to change, and then the shock coming from outside, and the two work together. This is the slow, painful process when the outer nature is too rigid and hard. If only our educational system had made from the beginning a connection to the inner being, had made that a reference at each moment that you have a choice, become quiet and feel within your desired nature, in that part deep inside where you're still and calm and you know already what is right. You do not need any external books of reference or training of morality or ethics. The moment you start doing something wrong, this inner sensitivity will say, I don't feel nice, I can't do this. The problem with this kind of upbringing would of course be a deep sensitivity, a rich inner life, which would not fit the expectations that current society has for you to be somehow always pushing and dominating and asserting and subduing others so that you may win. They're completely contrary values. And such a person will generally find himself to be a misfit in life, will struggle a lot. Or if, having learned to be sufficiently coarse on the surface, he begins a practice of meditation or asanas or pranayam, which begins an interiorization, the first thing that happens is a growing inner sensitivity with which he finds the very things he used to do before now to be suffocating or now difficult to manage because of the growth of the sensitivity. And I remember sitting in a group discussion in a spiritual community where someone who had just joined a few months before said, you know, for the last few months that I'm coming here and I'm going through this practice, I can't bear anymore what's happening around me. And I'm struggling, please, what can I do? And everybody in the group laughed and said, oh yeah, welcome home. Because it's an experience everybody has. And then what do? If the first movement is of sensitization, which makes you more vulnerable, it feels as if the spiritual life is not going to make you strong enough for that crude battle among the savages of humanity. But the reality is, having acquired that sensitivity, there is also the strength within which begins now to grow. And if the practice assists that process of building a poise of equality and drawing out from the inner strength, one comes forward with a far greater strength and resilience with the sensitivity still intact. I remember a friend of mine narrating this. It was a very fascinating example, and I heard it recently a few months ago. He said he was in his late teenage, I think, or just crossing that, when his father passed away. And this was in Sri Lanka. He was used to a certain procedure when somebody dies. Immediately after, whoever is present, they begin to do a certain chant, an invocation, a prayer for the smooth transition. But at the moment where the father passed away, he was there, his siblings, and mother and grandmother and others. And everybody was stunned, numb from the state and shock and the disorientation of this. And only two people, his mother was the one and his grandmother, only two people in his life he saw who had that resilience. His mother began to chant, who should have been the most moved perhaps in some ways. And she began to chant with a strength, which was amazing. He said, I've never seen that. And then it gave strength to others to chant. And so looking back at his life, he said, only my grandmother and my mother are the two people who were connected with Pondicherry, and I saw this strength only in them and nobody else in my family. Those who did not have the Pondi connection didn't have this. What was it in them? And it started a whole introspective process. What was it in them that gave them that resilience? What was coming from Pondicherry that gave them that? And obviously the conclusion was there's something about the spirituality which they imbibed, which gave them that strength. And it comes from the deep presence within, which is itself, although sensitive, carrying also the strength, the resilience, the poise of equality, and over time also draws out the power aspect of the soul, as well as the knowledge aspect of the soul, until it can draw out potentially, like the seed growing to become the tree, the fullness of omniscience and omnipotence in the love of the divine, which it must pour out equally. And all these are meant to be its completeness, each in its own way. But all that is waiting as a latent presence. But first, what happens when it puts itself out is this sensitivity, which does not match the current values of a coarse society. But if society was sensitive, these would be cherished. That society is not, is a pity. Sri Aurobindo makes this observation that in all of human history, there has never been such an extreme crudeness and coarseness in the turn to matter as we see today. And he's describing this 100 years ago. And this extreme turn to matter and the coarseness and crudeness that it has brought. The exaggeration of matter which denies everything else and anything higher and finer and more beautiful is as if thrown out in this. We have had cycles where matter was given great importance, but those finer things were also held. It's the reason why you see today, when you go to any of the old cultures, beauty, love of art in some way, some sense of aesthetics in the common man. And today, you do not find that aesthetics in the common art. The most popular, most high-selling of art has a crudeness and coarseness. The most popular top-of-the-charts music has a coarseness and numbing effect. You go into any public space, hotels, lobbies, the music that's being played, they call it muzak, is pointless, aimless, dry, repetitive, numbing on some level, hypnotic even in a way. Nothing uplifting, nothing joyous, nothing happy. It's as if those values have been set aside as somehow meaningless, unreal, fake. And the crudeness, coarseness, desensitizing influences have been projected as the ideal. And this complete reversal of values you see worsening over the last few decades. Now, it's not true in our individual lives. All of us yearn for something more beautiful, but when you reach out into that space, you do not find it in the public space, in the public discourse. Why? And children growing up today are as if brought up with that kind of harmful experience. I have been now increasingly to every college or university that I have visited. I find the numbers of children smoking. The problems of children at the age of 15 or 16 taking to alcohol or drugs is only increasing. And all of these are coarsening influences which cut off from the inner influence. They create a barrier, a smoky layer which blocks or even distorts some elements of the inner, or opens through drugs to the inner layers on the most crude part of the vital worlds. exposing you to influences and suggestions from those domains, when in fact the inner should be opening to the higher spiritual. And so everything you find today is towards this contrary influence. And yet, in spite of that, and for all of us here at least, the inner being pushed forward and asserted its influence and gave to the surface personality a forward spiritual turn. Otherwise, we would not be interested in something like this or following the kinds of life or practice that we do. And that's because the inner had grown sufficiently strong that in spite of these things, it could overcome. And so this is the transition point he is referring to. At a certain stage of development of the being, when the inner begins to predominate over the outer and come to the front, it begins to predominate. Once it begins to predominate, there may be many lives where that inner predomination grows. Or within a single life, you may still have the outer dominating in the early stages of childhood, and then the inner pushing forward to assert itself. But in each successive life, with greater capacity. Until not only it can begin to dominate, but it can begin to come forward. And this experience, this vocabulary of coming forward is very important. Sri Aurobindo uses this phrase, emerge or come forward, in relation to the psychic being in our personal growth. That we not only grow conscious of the divine presence within and our deepest soul and psychic being, but we create an external conducive environment that its influence can begin to grow more, and then its presence can come forward. And this part of coming forward is when its influence grows to such a degree that it is felt no more as deep, distant and covered up in many layers, but it's felt as if close and in front. Your own sense of identity is no more someone who's turning within to feel the presence within, but you feel the presence itself now filling you, and you as a separate someone becomes thinner and thinner, and emerging presence is the true person. There's a passage of transition where you serve it. It is the divine presence where you invoke it, where you refer to it more and more. But the transition is so smooth that eventually it is you. There is no other separate person. And that's the transition which is referring to here. The inner begins to predominate over there and over the outer and come to the front. Again, accepting this as a process through all the degrees of this emergence, what is described next happens, again in degrees. Past life memory does sometimes begin to emerge, as if from some submerged layer. Does sometimes, it doesn't have to. Because the emerging personality may not have any intention or interest in bringing forward those elements. They may still come. Or it may find it useful to bring forward certain elements of the past life memory. Why? Because it's useful for something to be done now. So only the elements useful will come forward. From where does it come? The feeling is as if some submerged layer. Again, the experience is so, the vocabulary is so precise. It was always there, but it was below the liminal, below the water. And from inside it comes. When it comes forward, you recognize it, oh yeah, it's as if somewhere within I always knew it. But I'd forgotten that I knew it, and now it comes forward. But what comes? But more readily in the shape of a perception of the stuff and power of past personalities that are effective in the composition of the being in the present life. So, in some past lives perhaps, I may have had a series of developments of a more heroic personality or an adventurous personality or some experience of leadership and courage in the face of extreme problems. In this life, perhaps the personality is more introspective, less adventurous and courageous. But some element of that has been brought forward because the work necessary may be to have a courage in the thought or in action in the field of knowledge. And so some element of that personality is there. And so what emerges as the past life memory is this component and its values that it has brought. And again, he uses very precise vocabulary. The stuff and power of past personalities. It's as if some substance of tendency and that power of standing up in spite of opposition, being willing to sacrifice yourself for an ideal, to cling to what is true, even in the face of extreme distress or consequence. That part comes forward. And you realize that it's not something new. The details of the memory may not be there, but you realize this capacity is in you and it's quite developed and formed. And now it is activated because of the circumstances required or whatever. Or with it, some memory also may be there. I've been in exactly the same kind of situation where I was persecuted, but I held to what was true, and in spite of all things, we overcame. And the memory may not be of overcoming. The memory may be of being persecuted and of losing. But the fact that you could stand through, even be killed at the stake if you stood for what was true and real, the fact that you stood is your survival. You did not compromise, you held to the ideal, and something of that strength stays. So more readily in the shape of a perception of the stuff and power of past personalities that are effective in the composition of the being in the present life. Then, in any precise and accurate detail of event and circumstance. So you don't actually remember all those details, but something feels like that. Although this too can recur in parts. Sometimes a flash may come, oh yes, I had that kind of thing once. But now the consciousness is sufficiently developed that the memory does not bother you. If that memory had come prematurely, when the personality was still the old ego sense, the memory would have seriously disrupted your sense of identity or freedom. But when the inner being has pushed forward and its memory comes, it has already a different way of relating to those events, however traumatic they have been to that personality. I look back and I say, oh yeah, I have done that. Interesting. That's all. And the feeling of the strength or the ability to hold and stand firm, that's the energy of the experience which is retained. Although this too can recur in parts or be recovered by concentration from the subliminal vision. Now it's possible that you feel this and you say, where does it come from? And you can choose to try to recover some specific memory. And he describes now the 3 ways by which this specific memory can be recovered. Recovered by concentration from the subliminal vision, from some secret memory, or from our inner conscious substance. Now, 3 very different kinds of experience. The first is the most superficial of the 3, and the third is the deepest, and you will see how it works. So as you turn in, you feel this, and you try to feel, well, what was it like? And briefly an image comes. I have a memory of standing before a whole group of people who were mocking me and standing firm. Maybe that's what it is. Or I have a memory that we were as a group together, cast out by society, but we stood in the forest, we lived together, and we lived for this ideal and held it. That image or that feel which comes with the image. Or from some secret memory. Now this image comes like a vision. I see a picture. Or a memory comes which carries not just a picture but the feeling of it, more complete. And there I can feel what it was like. I feel the sense of loneliness, the sense of being abandoned by society, but also the sense of being cared for by our community. We were maybe a dozen. That comes as a memory. But it was a secret memory that I had forgotten I had. Or the third, from our inner conscious substance. And this is the most deep. It's as if the substance of the soul is coming forward, and with it you relive the full force of that experience. You are that personality, that memory, the feeling, that sense of what was done. And that's it. You may not recall anything else of the life. You may not recall what food you ate. So if there was a vision, you may have a picture even with clothing or the food eating if it was important. But in this part, you will have just the imprint of the consciousness, and all the other details may not matter at all. Or you may have a combination of all three. A flash of an image which makes you dwell on it, which draws out the deeper memory, which makes you dwell deeper and calls out the full spiritual content of the experience which the soul carries. Or the reverse. The spiritual content comes, and after a while with it some of the emotions, and then the images build around it. But there are three very different experiences, and one could tap any one of them separate from the others. And one can tap, that's the point. So when you go in deep hypnosis, in normal hypnotic regression, you will only tap images. And that's where you can pick up somebody else's images or ideas also. But if you're used to deep meditation, then with or without hypnosis, you can go deep within and touch upon the second and third layers. The third layer is possible only if you're used to being able to go deep enough to remain in deep closeness with your soul, its presence, its aspiration, its light, and its substance. He uses this word substance, from our inner conscious substance, the part which is the substance that has been carried across lives. But this detailed memory is of minor importance to nature, universal nature, in her normal work, and she makes small or no provision for it. So in the way we are formed, in the way the personality and our evolution takes place, nature says, that's not important. She does not make provision for it. If she had made provision for it, then this would be much more frequent or easy. What is her focus? It is the shaping of the future evolution of the being with which she is concerned. The past is put back, kept behind the veil, and used only as an occult source of materials for the present and future. It's valuable, but as a hidden source. Its material comes forward as needed, but you don't care where it comes from, you don't care what content it had of those lives. What is important is what you do with it now for the future. And so this is the orientation he gives to the whole thing of nature's purpose. This also should be our purpose. Idle curiosity increasingly becomes meaningless when one grows in the presence of the soul. As long as it was just the mind personality, in teenage you would say, oh yeah, it would be so nice to know what was the past. I was so and so, I did such and such. No, it's not. But when the soul comes forward, even if you were told those things, what does it matter? I'm here, this is what is important. What I'm working for, which is the whole soul's vision, that is what matters. And only to the extent it helps, you may draw out what is required. But even that, as needed for the future. Now this orientation is extremely important, because the next paragraph will tell us what we need to do in our surface personality to align to the soul's purpose, and how it can then even take elements of this personality and use it across lives, which should permit an actual conscious continuity of personality across lives without any of the problems of a narrow, rigid personality. Your personality would have to become as flexible as the soul's need is. Your personality should be able to be as rich and expressive of the soul's consciousness as it wants. Then you can make this transition without needing to throw aside a form and material and rebuild each time. And this is going to be the key for us in this part of the study. So for now, what is important for us is to put in context. I remember in my childhood this very clear sense. It had happened that at some point when the mother named me, there was a mention of some past incarnation and so on. And so people around me would sometimes go, dib, 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 you know, you were someone. Okay. And always clearly in the consciousness there was a strong sense of no. No looking back, no looking around. This is the focus. And there was a very clear sense of not identifying or associating with anything of the inheritance, of the family, of the biology, even of the psychology. There's something extremely important where the whole personality has to be new created with the new material that the mother is bringing in this new consciousness, in this new substance, for a future which is a leap forward that has nothing to do with the past. This sense, which now I can articulate with a conscious intelligence, was there in the child form in an instinctive way. And if there was anything which came, which tended to want to associate with the past or with the biological heredity or family connections, it would just cut off and refuse and block it. It created certain blocks in the personality because of that strong instinctive protection. But it was clear that it was the choice of the soul that it had imprinted in the personality to protect from this mixture of anything which belonged to the past evolutionary work. And the full focus was this new consciousness, this new possibility, and a total dedication and living in the future and having nothing to do with the past. Today I can look back and value it for what it was. At that time it was a confusing experience, although one knew what had to be done. And I'm seeing this, I'm looking at this last sentence in this context for all of us, that whatever we may have brought from the past is only as relevant as it helps for the future. And we must consciously set aside all the past influences and formations and tendencies so that we may leap forward without any baggage for this new work of the new consciousness and the new world that is waiting to manifest. The more in our consciousness we belong to the new world, the more easily we are able to make this leap without things pulling us back or slowing us down. But this must be consciously cultivated in us in this way. So this detailed memory is of minor importance to nature in her normal work. It is the shaping of the future evolution of the being with which she is concerned. The past is put back, kept behind the veil, and used only as an occult source of materials for the present and the future. And the next paragraph says, this conception of personality and person must modify at the same time our current ideas about immortality of the soul. So what is the sense of immortality that we should have, and how do we develop this? We will take up next Sunday. We can meditate on this for a few minutes.